So as you know, this workshop's hosted by the Emerging Minds Network, and that is a mental health research network which has been funded by UK Research, one of the UK, well, the group of UK research councils. And the purpose of our network is to support and encourage more research that goes across sectors and across disciplines that has the potential to make a difference to children and young people's mental health. And back in January 2019, which feels like a very long time ago now, our partners Young Minds and also the Centre for Mental Health ran workshops with young people, parents and carers, practitioners, and also policymakers to help us to identify priorities for research going forwards. And this helped us to set 4 research challenges, which are all shown here. And you can read more about all of these on our Emerging Minds website. But one of the research challenges is called Voices, Power and Attitudes. And this is the research challenge that we're going to be focusing on in our next funding call. So essentially the Voices, Power and Attitude challenge was all around the question of how can societal values, attitudes and behaviours be changed in ways that have a positive impact on children and young people's mental health and well-being. And so our first funding call in 2020 invited proposals for research projects on this and 2 of our other research challenges, but we didn't end up funding any projects which specifically funded the Voices, Power and Attitudes theme. So today we're really pleased to launch our second funding call, where we're really trying to target research proposals which focus on the Voices, Power and Attitudes challenge, but specifically focusing on the topic of racism and mental health of children and young people in the UK, because this has been really highlighted as a key area of need by work that we've been doing. You'll hear more about that from some of our fantastic advisors as we go on, and also from a lot of our stakeholder work that we've been doing. So I'm going to be handing over in a moment to 3 of our really fantastic advisors, Nikki, Jawad and Fiore, who've been working over the last 4 months to identify the focus and priorities for this funding call. And then Emily will then outline the key dates and some practical guidance about the call. And then we'll have a chance to ask us some questions. But please do use the chat function throughout the meeting to introduce yourselves, say who you are, where you're from, but also please do post any questions or comments in that as we go on, and we can return to those as we go on. So just a couple of things to keep in mind is that obviously some colleagues joining us today may be personally affected by some of the topics that we're discussing. So I'd just like to encourage you to keep that in mind when you're listening and discussing with others. As I mentioned, we'll be recording the talks to share, but we won't record the actual discussion part. We won't share the discussion part. So hopefully that all sounds fine, but if you do have any questions about it, please do pop them in the chat, as I mentioned. And I will now hand over to our 3 advisors. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Fiore, who's a first-year PhD student, who's also a mental health advocate and a qualified personal trainer who focuses on using physical activity and exercise as a tool to help those struggling with their mental health. And Fiore recently undertook a 3-month internship with us at Emerging Minds and is completing a rapid scoping review of this work. And I'm also delighted to introduce you to Nikki, who's a lived experience leader and mental health advocate dedicated to raising awareness about social and systemic barriers to healing from trauma and childhood adversity. And Nikki's the founder of the Bounce Black community. And also I'd like to introduce you to Jawad, who is a mental health activist and works as a freelance social media manager. And he's worked with multiple mental health campaigns, including Our Minds, Our Future, and Debating Mental Health. So we're really delighted that the 3 of them have been able to work with us so closely on this call, and really delighted that they're able to join us today to tell you a bit more about it. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. Just share my screen. Ooh. Probably. Okay, there we go. So hi everyone, as Kathy mentioned, I'm Nikki and I am an advisor to the Emerging Minds Network, specifically for the Voices, Power and Attitudes Research Challenge, which we're going to talk about today just to give you an overview of some of the work that we've been doing as part of identifying some of the research areas that we might want to fund projects looking into with respect to the impact of racism on children and young people, their mental health in the UK. And so what we did was we held 2 workshops, one with young people and another with professionals. In the young people's workshop, we invited young people between the ages of 16 to 25 to share their views on different topics broadly within the framework of racism and how it affects young people's mental health in the UK. We had at length discussions with them about how they felt racism impacts them, or how they perceive it to impact their peers, and how it affects mental health as well. And then after that, our findings from that, we kind of put together into like a presentation that we gave to some professionals who work with young people, and basically just put it to them to ask what they felt was missing from the themes that we had identified from our interactions with the young people, and ask them to kind of fill in the gaps about what they perceive to be some potential areas that we could look into in terms of funding for the project that we're working on. So yeah, and then I think Fieri also presented a record scope review, which she may talk about a bit later on, but that's just like an overview of what we did in terms of the 2 workshops. And so in this presentation, we're just going to bring up some of the findings from that to just spark some ideas for some of the potential work that you might be interested in pursuing. And broadly, the research questions that we're exploring are what the impact is of racism on the mental health of children and young people in the UK, and then what might be some effective interventions that could address racism in ways that will benefit children and young people, and specifically with reference to their mental health. And so, yeah. Jad.
Thank you, Nikki. So then moving on to what kind of we found from both of those workshops and presentations, we kind of distilled that after transcribing what we had found with the young people and kind of the overview of what we found with professionals event. We kind of put that forward as we've put forward some priorities that we think would be really beneficial for that. I do want to kind of stress that this is kind of a brief overview, so do kind of recommend that you check out all the other resources that we do have. This presentation will be available on the website, so you can kind of see this, but also get access to all the other resources that we have. So hopefully that will give you a very deeper understanding of what it is, because there was so much that was out there, and me, Nikki, and Fiori spent so much time kind of trying to distill it, and we found it really, really hard. So hopefully, if you do engage with all the rest of the stuff that's out there, you will get a much brighter, full picture of what we had found. So just in terms of priorities, though, we kind of came down to 2 main things, which was the impact and the intervention, which Nikki has just mentioned with the research questions. So the kind of the top line impact that we thought was kind of a reference in terms of mental health from the young people was this idea of the day-to-day psychological toll of racism on their mental health. So it's things like code switching, or like even the subtle effects that don't generally get the limelight when it comes to talking about racism, and how that's impacting young people's mental health. So I think one big thing that we felt was that, why are we only talking about the big impacts of racism, as vital as they are to talk about, but we also should talk about, the everyday things that is then impacting young people's mental health on a regular basis, which will then have a really big effect on how they deal with their well-being. So added to that is also the early experiences that young people face, so how they are having a long-term effect on their mental health. So things like identity. So when young people are kind of finding their identity, they're having to deal with racism. So how does this impact them? And there was a lot of discussion around that too. And finally, just talking about the self-protective adaptive behavior and mental health. So when we're talking about self-protective adaptive behavior, it's things like having to present differently, or present not as authentically as you'd want to, because you're worried about how that's going to impact how people perceive you, and whether people are racist towards you, whether that's through microaggressions or through more overt forms. It's really important to kind of bear this in mind too, and how changing the behavior and not presenting authentically can really impact young people's mental health. So then we've just included some quotes that we thought were very, very impactful. Again, there are so many more quotes on the slides that will be provided to you as well. So we do stress that you have a look at those, but this is just a brief kind of overview. So with the self-protective adaptive behavior, young people are like, for one young person was like, from a young age, I've been told certain things like how to end a situation, like if please do stop and search. Like, how does that then impact how this person is going about in the street, and when they come across police officers, how does that impact their mental health? So then moving on to emotional toll and trauma, so things like how you have to make twice the effort to make them feel comfortable, i.e. People from people of color, and how you have to make them believe that you're good enough for a role when you're going to apply for it. And especially now with young people having to like go out and get jobs, and with the environment that it's in, you're having to make much more effort to try and secure those jobs. So there are a lot of statistics around how difficult it is, how much more difficult it is as a young person of color to actually go out and find jobs. So then that's impacting that too. So there's lots of stuff behind this, and the young people are quite, when they're talking about the impact of racism on their mental health, they talked quite a lot about that. So yeah, really do stress that you look at those quotes further. And then the second part was obviously the interventions that we were talking about, and how what interventions can be put into place to address how racism impacts mental health. So some of the stuff that was discussed with the young people, but also with the professionals, was the idea of early intervention, how racism within younger years can really affect. So thinking about the schooling years and how school can then impact how these people see themselves later on. So one thing was referenced within our discussions with young people was this prison to school pipeline. Sorry, school to prison pipeline. Got that the wrong way around. So the school to prison pipeline was something that the young people kind of mentioned, and they felt like those young people that weren't getting support, whether that was because of racism, and quite often it was, they felt like that intervention wasn't there. So how can we help and prevent that from happening, and have a discussion about that? Then it was that anti-racism education. So a lot of the young people did feel like it was difficult to talk about racism. So having that in place, will that then help these young people with their mental health, knowing about that and letting other people know about that? And finally, one example that was brought up was the mentoring and support that young people can receive to know how to navigate certain situations. And I think not knowing how to navigate situations when it comes to racism, and how racism can impact their kind of mental health and how they respond to certain situations, getting that mentoring as a support mechanism can really help with their mental health. So these are the kind of ideas that came up. Again, I know I keep saying this, but I really do stress that you have a look at the rest of the resources, because there is a lot to kind of delve into and understand kind of what the research that we did. So yeah.
Thank you, Jared. So now I'm going to speak about other important considerations that you should have when looking at these priorities. So number one is the experiences of racism. We really stress that it's important to actually understand the experience and the type of racism young people are facing in order to understand how it affects their mental health. So for example, understanding what children and young people's understanding of racism actually is quite important in order to then figure out how it's affecting their mental health. Also, how young people and children articulate their experiences of racism is a huge thing. We know that a lot of adults, the professionals did mention that even they struggle with speaking about racism. So understanding how young children speak about it and young people speak about it is quite important. And also the experiences are direct and indirect. And this is because of the age differences. So with young children, they may face a lot more indirect racism, especially young children who may not be in school or during primary school. They may also face they may also see racism happen to their family members rather than them directly face it. And that could have a different toll, for example, to someone in secondary school who's facing direct racism. So it's quite important when you're looking at the impacts and you're looking at effective interventions to also consider the type of racism that they're facing. So another thing to consider as well, before I go on, the quotes from young people about experiences, like Jawad has said, there's a lot more quotes in order to fully understand, but a few that we brought up was the idea that even though you've never done anything illegal, you still feel like you have to be kind of like over the top and express that when you're in shopping places, that you've done nothing wrong and you're not going to steal and you're going to buy something. Also the idea of systemic and institutional racism. So the idea that the system, in particular, young people had spoken about how education system fails them, and a lot of young people who have ended up in prison, they could have been helped a lot earlier. And also the idea that it's in extreme cases where people are having psychotic disorders, that they're then given attention and help in healthcare systems. But what about in the beginning when they're struggling? Why are they not receiving help then? So another thing to consider is community-specific approaches. So this is something that has also come up in my scoping review, the idea that don't put everyone in as BAME. Black, Asian, minority, ethnic are all separate, and they all may have separate feelings towards racism. They may all experience racism differently. Some may experience racism more than others. So it's quite important to consider when you are doing this research, are you clumping everyone together or are you going to be doing it separate? It's also quite good to consider the experiences of racism in terms of first generation, second generation refugees. Those who have parents who have migrants may experience racism completely different to those who have had parents that were born here and raised here. Also intersectionality and mental health as well. So those that, for example, from the LGBTQ+ community may face racism alongside something else as well, alongside other forms of discrimination. It's also really important to co-design with communities and organizations, and also young people and those who've lived experiences. These are the people you want to be reaching out to and speaking to. So we really do push the idea that do try and ensure that young people are involved with this, particularly because it's about young people, and also where possible, work with communities who are already working with young people because they've already built that rapport with young people and they already have the trust of young people. And also going off for that one, the idea of going on with community-based work rather than creating something new. There's a lot of amazing work that's already happening. So especially with interventions, it may be that you may just find someone who's already doing great work and you want to research more into it. So we really push that when thinking about the priorities. These are also really important considerations to have. And for more information, we've got the resources on the website. So you'll be able to see my scope and review, what I've done so far. You'll also be able to see Jawad and Nikki's amazing work and their presentation looking into young people, and that one's in a lot more detail as well. So we really highly recommend that you go there and you make sure you've seen all of that as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jawad and Nikki and Fiore, just to give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the work you've been doing over the last 4 months, and definitely echo Fiore's point there about, you know, taking the time just to go and watch back the films from the previous event. And I shared the link in the chat box. Okay, so I'm just going to now just share a little bit more about the practical details of the funding call that we have planned. And then, as Kathy said, after that, there'll be a chance to ask us any questions. If any are popping into your mind, then do share them in the chat box and we can come back to those. Right, I'm just going to share my screen then with the details about the funding call. Okay, so we are inviting proposals for research projects of up to 12 months in duration, so kind of anticipating that these would need to be completed by September of next year, September 2022. And the total funding we have available is £70,000. So we have in mind that we would be funding kind of either one project, £70,000, or perhaps two projects of £35,000. And as we've touched on, really to echo the points made earlier, but we're really encouraging research collaborations, particularly with the voluntary and community sector, you know, those with lived experience, particularly young people, but also across disciplines. So collaboration is, as we'll come back to, a very important kind of consideration for us. A really key point we'd like to make is that the project lead, so the lead applicant or one of the co-leads, must be based at a UK higher education institution, so UK university. And this is because the Emerging Minds Network is funded by UK Research and Innovation, which is all the research councils coming together. So that's kind of one of their criteria of their funding of our network. But so those things together mean that we are really keen to support you if you perhaps don't have the collaborations in place at the moment, but you would like to be linked up with some researchers, or vice versa, you're keen to kind of forge more links with the community sector or with young people groups, then do let us know. So that will be something we're really keen to support you with as much as we can. And one way you can do this is by expressing interest. So this is very optional, this first stage, the expression of interest stage, but definitely encourage you to do so. There's two things we can help you with. Obviously, we'll provide some formative feedback if you express interest and tell us about your idea or your project idea. But also you could tell us when you express interest, actually, I would be interested in, collaborations with different disciplines or with community groups, and we can look to do that and make some introductions for you. So if you do express interest, the feedback on that will be by about the 14th of May. But the key deadline really that you need to kind of keep in mind is that 9 AM on the 14th of June is the deadline for your finalised applications. And the idea would be that we'll shortlist. I'll tell you a bit more about what we'll be looking for in the applications, but that we would do short Zoom interviews with shortlisted applicants at the beginning of July. With those, we wouldn't be asking for kind of formal presentations, and we would let you know the kind of topics that we'd like to discuss further with you in advance. Yeah, so really important to keep in mind is their assessment criteria. And for those of you who did apply last time, this is broadly the same. So really we're interested in your research project's potential for impact, how much you're making the most of opportunities to collaborate and involve, particularly young people and those with lived experience. But also, of course, we need to see very strong research plans and really rigorous plans for the research that's going to take place. So to go a bit more into detail here, really the impact is around just the research project. You've explained really how you feel the project is going to make a significant contribution to the priorities that Nikki, Jawad and Fiore were mentioning, that the priorities that young people have mentioned in this area. And also, keeping in mind that broader Voices, Power and Attitudes Research Challenge. Yeah, and continuing on, the extent to which the outputs are going to be useful and shared with those who can best use them. But also, what's the potential for the research to be sustained or developed? How will this project really accelerate the pace of research and practice in this area? Because Fiore's scoping review has really highlighted that this is an area that needs much more research attention going forwards. So a bit more about the collaboration involvement criteria. Yes, we are looking for research projects to include partners beyond universities, and that they are substantive and meaningful, and the extent to which stakeholders such as young people are involved in different aspects of the project. We're keen to support early career researchers, so we'd really like to see them taking lead roles in the project. And also, where possible, that you're thinking about what other types of expertise might help the research project, bring in different types of academic disciplines. And yet a bit more about the research excellence and planning, what we're meaning, what we'll be looking for there. So, you know, that you're clearly setting out why you're focusing on this particular research question or questions, and showing how it's a gap in the existing literature, how your methods will achieve those aims, and also that you've thought through your plan. Can it be implemented realistically in the time, because it is a short time frame that we're setting out here, and just that you've got the team that is going to be able to implement the project. We'll also be looking for value for money, of course, because we realise this isn't a huge amount for a research project, so we'll be looking for people to really think through how they're spending the money, but also that you are thinking through risks, managing them appropriately, and are showing that you're committed to reproducible research practices. To give you a bit of an idea, I mean, in terms of how the assessment will work, the review panel, a bit like last time, will reflect the Emerging Minds Network. So there will be members of our leadership team, so kind of researchers from different disciplines. There will be advisors such as Nikki and Jawed and Fiore, who bring lived experience expertise, and there will also be representatives from the community and voluntary sector. So, the people reviewing your application will be looking at it with kind of different hats on, different interests. So that's really worth bearing in mind when you're putting together your application, which does make it challenging because you've got to you've got to impress all of those different perspectives all at once, and our reviewers will be using those 3 key headings that I've mentioned to assess the application. So they'll your application would be scored on each of those areas, and then that will be used to kind of bring to a shortlisting meeting where research projects to go to interview will be decided. But broadly, at the interview stage as well, these are the criteria we're going to be assessing applications against. So there are quite a few things to bear in mind in terms of this funding call, because we are, as I mentioned, following the Research Council guidelines. So that brings with it certain restrictions, and one of the key ones to bear in mind, actually probably the second one, is probably one of the most pertinent ones to mention. So we are really keen to encourage partners beyond universities to be part of your research team, but there is a limit, so they can receive up to 30% of the total that you're applying for, but they can of course claim 100% of their costs, whereas in line with UK research innovation guidelines, UK universities will be able to claim for 80% of the full economic costs of their part of the project. So there will be a briefing that we'll share on the Emerging Minds website, and the link that I shared in the chat box, which will go into this in more detail. And we've also got a kind of standard award letter, so that will be worth you reviewing and perhaps sharing with your business development team or your contracts team, just to check that you are comfortable and could agree to those conditions. And here's a bit of an example. So it's this idea of, if you're a university and you were looking to receive a grant of £35,000 for your research project, you would need in your budget to just outline the full economic cost, which would be greater than that, would be 43,750. Obviously a little bit different if you're working with a non-academic partner as well. And we are really keen again to have applicants really think about their administrative costs. So this will be something you'll need to talk to your research contracts team about, but we're keen that they constitute no more than 20% of the total application costs. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through that, but do ask us any questions, and as I say, there'll be a bit more detail about this in the guidance. Right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. Before we wrap up then, a last chance, if there's anything else on your mind, do let us know. Okay, well, we'll quickly then just do a quick recap of some of the key dates and key kind of actions or next steps. But if anything pops into your head, do post it so we don't miss that. I'll quickly just share my screen, but I think Kathy was just going to share with us the kind of next steps, key dates.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Oh. There it's gone. Yeah, so just a few things to highlight. So we will email out the slides presented here to you all, so you will all have this, and we'll also post the final application form and the guidance, the template contract as well by Friday of this week, and that will all be on our website at the address that is right at the bottom of this slide, which finishes funding call 2. As Fiore said earlier on, we really recommend that you watch back the recordings from our priority setting workshop on the 21st of January to get the best sense of the priorities that young people and stakeholders spoke to us about. You'll be able to find the link to that on our website as well. I've just seen another question. Is there a template for the expression of interest, or should we just summarize the project into an abstract? So yes, there is a template for that, Emily. So I'm looking at you, Emily, but I think that will be also on the website this week. Is that right? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, essentially though, if you're thinking about it at the moment, as I say, the format will be, your name, role or organisation, and then literally just a bit of a free form for kind of just telling us your thoughts so far, or the experience you have that you'd like to be connected up with. So but we were thinking that would just be in a kind of an online form, as though you're signing up to a newsletter, that type of form that you can hopefully quite easily do. Yeah, so the aim is that it's quite a light touch process rather than you spending a lot of time on it at that stage. So just a reminder of the dates. So the expressions of interest will be open until 9 AM on the 29th of April. And as Emily said, that's not compulsory, that part of the process. It's really just to try to make it helpful for you to, and if it means we can help match make, we can give a bit of feedback, then we're really keen to do that. And then the final deadline for applications is 9 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of June this year. We also just wanted to highlight, we've recently launched a number of special interest research groups. And please do have a look at our website, because there's a number of really fantastic, very active, exciting groups that have been formed to really try and push forward research relating to children and young people's mental health in a number of different areas. And one of those is led by the University of Nottingham and the Anna Freud Centre, which is really continuing conversations on this topic of mental health and racism, the impacts on children and young people. So please do have a look at the Emerging Minds website to get a bit more information about that, and consider signing up and joining in with some of their activities and conversations. And do have a look at the other special interest groups as well. They've all made some really nice short videos, so you can get little snapshots of what they're up to. So that's a nice way to get a taster, and they're all obviously keen to engage as many people as they can. So I think that's everything that I was going to say, apart from, of course, massive thank you to Fiore, Jawed and Nikki for all the work that they've done to help us put together this call and all of the underpinning work before it. And then, of course, joining us today, joining us for many other events to help get across the important messages that they've been pulling out of the literature, and also from conversations with young people and stakeholders. So huge thanks to you all. We really, really appreciate it. And of course, huge thanks to Emily for organising everything and making it all run so smoothly. If you have any questions at all, please do drop us an email. We're really happy to respond, and do keep an eye on our Twitter for updates. And if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, do sign up to that, because then you get lots of other useful and interesting information and updates too. So Emily, unless I've forgotten anything, no, I think that's it then. So thank you ever so much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you with your expressions of interest and or applications. So thanks again. Bye-bye.